Pete Rose's ban for gambling. Pete Rose was one of the greatest hitters in baseball history, but his legacy collapsed in 1989 when investigators discovered he had bet thousands of dollars on Major League Baseball games, including those involving his own team, the Cincinnati Reds. Baseball had a strict rule against gambling since the 1919 Black Sox Scandal, and Rose's actions struck at the core of the game's integrity. Commissioner Abe Bartlett Giamatti banned Rose from baseball for life, making him ineligible for the Hall of Fame. Rose admitted years later that he had placed those bets, but he has never been reinstated. His case remains one of the darkest chapters in MLB history because it raised the question of whether fans could trust the honesty of competition when the manager himself was betting on the outcome. The Steroid era and the BALCO scandal. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Major League Baseball saw a huge rise in home run totals and player power numbers, but it was later revealed that many stars were using performance-enhancing drugs. The BALCO scandal in 2003 exposed how athletes, including Barry Bonds, Jason Giambi, and Gary Sheffield, obtained illegal steroids from a California laboratory. Congressional hearings followed in 2005, with players like Mark McGwire refusing to answer questions and Rafael Palmeiro denying use under oath, only to test positive months later. The scandal damaged MLB's reputation for years as it revealed a culture where cheating through drug use was widespread, and league officials had looked the other way to protect soaring attendance and TV ratings. The Black Sox Scandal of 1919. The darkest early moment in MLB history came when 8 members of the Chicago White Sox were accused of fixing the 1919 World Series against the Cincinnati Reds in exchange for money from gambling syndicates. Players like Shoeless Joe Jackson and Eddie Saccott were implicated, and though they were acquitted in court, Commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis banned them all for life. This scandal almost destroyed public trust in baseball, forcing MLB to create the position of commissioner to restore integrity. The Black Sox scandal remains infamous because it showed how organized crime and gambling could directly corrupt America's pastime at its highest level. Mickey Mantle and Billy Martin's bar fights and ban. In the 1970s, Commissioner Bowie Kuhn suspended Mickey Mantle and Billy Martin, 2 former Yankee legends, from official baseball activities because they had taken jobs as greeters and promoters for casinos in Atlantic City. But Mantle and Martin had long histories of destructive behavior while playing, including violent bar fights, public drunkenness, and incidents that embarrassed their teams. ESPN avoids going into detail about how alcoholism, violence, and reckless off-field choices consumed many stars of that era, but Mantle's struggles in particular showed how even one of the most beloved players could be haunted by addiction and poor decisions: the death of Lyman Bostock. In 1978, California Angels outfielder Lyman Bostock was shot and killed in Gary, Indiana, while sitting in a car with a family friend. He had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The shooter was targeting his estranged wife, who was sitting next to Bostock, and killed the ballplayer by mistake. Bostock was only 27 years old and had just signed one of baseball's first million-dollar contracts. His murder shocked the sports world, and the shooter was later found not guilty by reason of insanity, which outraged many. ESPN rarely highlights the gruesome details of this tragedy, but it remains one of the most heartbreaking losses in MLB history. The Mitchell Report. In December 2007, former Senator George Mitchell released a 400-page report that named 89 Major League players connected to performance-enhancing drugs. The investigation used evidence from trainers, clubhouse staff, and seized documents. Prominent stars like Roger Clemens, Andy Pettitte, and Eric Gagne were all mentioned. The report revealed that steroid and human growth hormone use was not limited to a few players, but had become widespread across teams. It showed how front offices often ignored suspicious behavior to protect their investments. The Mitchell report forced MLB to strengthen its drug testing policies, but the damage to the league's credibility was permanent, as fans were left to wonder which historic performances were achieved naturally and which were chemically boosted. The Death of Ray Chapman. On August 16, 1920, Cleveland Indians shortstop Ray Chapman was struck in the head by a pitch thrown by New York Yankees pitcher Carl Mays. Helmets were not used at the time, and Chapman never regained consciousness. He died the next morning, becoming the only Major League player ever killed by a pitch. The incident shocked baseball, as Chapman was one of the league's most popular players. The tragedy pushed baseball to pay closer attention to player safety, though helmets were not required until decades later. Sports networks rarely revisits this story because of its gruesome nature, but it remains a pivotal moment showing the life and death risks players faced on the field. Roberto Alomar's sexual misconduct allegations. In 2021, Major League Baseball placed Hall of Famer Roberto Alomar on its ineligible list after an independent investigation confirmed allegations of sexual misconduct dating back to his time as an executive with the Toronto Blue Jays. Alomar was once celebrated as one of the best second basemen in history, but the findings led MLB to cut all official ties with him. His plaque was removed from league facilities, and he lost roles connected to youth development. While there were reports on the suspension, the disturbing details of the allegations and their long-term impact on MLB's image were often downplayed, making it one of the darker controversies surrounding a Hall of Fame player. The Pittsburgh drug trials. In the mid-1980s, federal prosecutors investigated a cocaine distribution network tied directly to major league players. The Pittsburgh drug trials exposed how widespread cocaine use was inside MLB clubhouses. Over a dozen players, including stars like Keith Hernandez, Dave Parker, and Tim Raines, were called to testify about their drug use and connections to dealers. Some players admitted buying drugs in stadium bathrooms before games, while others revealed how cocaine use had become normalized within the sport. Although most received only light punishments, the scandal permanently stained baseball's reputation during that decade. It remains one of the darkest examples of how substance abuse infiltrated the league at its highest level: the death of Steve Olin and Tim Crews. On March 22, 1993, Cleveland Indians pitchers Steve Olin and Tim Crews were killed in a boating accident during spring training in Florida. Another pitcher, Bob Ojeda, was severely injured but survived. Crews had been drinking, and toxicology reports later showed his blood alcohol level was above the legal limit. The boat struck a dock at high speed, throwing the men into the water. The tragedy devastated the Indians organization, leaving the team without two of its players just before the season began. Major sports news rarely covers the details because alcohol use, recklessness, and the gruesome deaths were involved, but the story stands as one of MLB's most shocking off-field accidents. The shooting of Denny McLain's associates. Denny McLain, the last pitcher to win 30 games in a season, became just as famous for his criminal troubles after retirement. In 1985, two of his business associates were found murdered, and while McLain was not charged in the killings, he was linked to illegal bookmaking and other crimes. Over the years, McLain served prison time for embezzlement, racketeering, and drug trafficking. His name became tied to gambling and organized crime, overshadowing his Hall of Fame-level talent on the mound. ESPN avoids deep coverage of McLain's post-career scandals because they cross into violent and criminal worlds far from the ballpark, making them some of the darkest chapters for a former MLB star. The Luis Salazar beating. In 2001, minor league manager Luis Salazar, a former major league player, was standing near the dugout during an Atlanta Braves spring training game when he was struck in the face by a line drive foul ball. The impact shattered bones around his left eye and forced doctors to remove the eye completely. Salazar survived, but the injury was gruesome and life-altering. He returned to coaching but carried the permanent effects of the accident. The details of incidents like this were rarely shown because of the graphic and disturbing nature of the injuries. But it highlights the extreme dangers faced by players and coaches, even in what seems like a casual preseason game. The death of Donnie Moore. In 1989, former California Angels pitcher Donnie Moore shot his wife 3 times during a domestic dispute before turning the gun on himself. His wife survived, but Moore died at the scene. His violent end was linked by some to the crushing burden of his career, particularly a blown save in the 1986 ALCS that haunted him for years. The incident shocked baseball, as Moore was only 35 at the time and left behind 3 children. Because of the violence and tragedy involved, sports news avoids going into detail about the case, but it remains one of the most disturbing personal stories connected to an MLB player. Doc Ellis and LSD on the mound. On June 12, 1970, Pittsburgh Pirates pitcher Doc Ellis took the mound against the San Diego Padres while under the influence of LSD. He later admitted that he had been high on the drug when he threw what is officially scored as a no-hitter. Ellis claimed he could barely see the batters, relying on his catcher to signal where to throw and trusting instinct. While the game became legendary, the underlying story was darker. Drug use at such an extreme level that a player risked his health and safety, along with that of others on the field. ESPN typically avoids going into the psychedelic details, but the event is one of MLB's strangest and most controversial moments. Jose Canseco's steroid revelations. Jose Canseco published his book Juiced in 2005, where he openly described his steroid use during his career and accused many other players of doing the same. He named stars like Mark McGwire, Rafael Palmeiro, and Juan Gonzalez, claiming steroids were not just common, but almost required to succeed in the league. Canseco's admissions confirmed what many suspected, but were afraid to say publicly, that performance-enhancing drugs had been a core part of MLB culture for decades. His book and later public statements were explosive, sparking outrage and investigations. ESPN reported on the fallout, but often downplayed the full scope of his claims because of how damaging they were to baseball's image. The Len Bias connection to MLB locker rooms. Len Bias's death in 1986 from a cocaine overdose shook the sports world. While Bias was drafted by the NBA's Boston Celtics, his death also shined a light on cocaine use in other professional sports, including baseball. Investigations at the time revealed that many MLB players were regularly using cocaine, often in team clubhouses, sometimes before games. Players admitted buying drugs from dealers who had access to stadiums. ESPN largely avoids linking Bias's overdose to MLB's internal problems, but the tragedy forced the league to take a harder stance on drug policies, as cocaine had already claimed careers and was threatening lives inside baseball. The tragedy of Nick Adenhart. In April 2009, 22-year-old Los Angeles Angels pitcher Nick Adenhart had just pitched 6 scoreless innings in his season debut. Hours later, he was killed in a car crash caused by a drunk driver who had run a red light. 2 others in the car with him also died. The driver had been driving with a suspended license for prior offenses and was later sentenced to 51 years to life in prison. Adenhart's death was devastating not just for the Angels, but for baseball fans everywhere, as he had been seen as one of the sport's rising young pitchers. ESPN covered the crash, but avoided dwelling on the violent details, leaving much of the darker reality to other outlets. The Death of Roy Halladay. On November 7, 2017, former pitcher Roy Halladay died when his small plane crashed into the Gulf of Mexico near Florida. He was flying an experimental aircraft at low altitude, performing risky maneuvers before the crash. Toxicology tests later showed he had a mix of drugs in his system, including opioids and amphetamines. Halladay had been a 2-time Cy Young Award winner, one of the most respected pitchers of his era. His sudden and tragic death shocked the baseball world and raised difficult questions about substance use, mental health, and the pressures athletes face after retirement. The death of Jose Fernandez. In September 2016, Miami Marlins pitcher Jose Fernandez died in a boating crash off the coast of Miami at age 24. Investigators determined that Fernandez had been driving the boat while under the influence of alcohol and cocaine when it slammed into a jetty at high speed, killing him and 2 passengers. Fernandez had been one of the league's brightest young stars, known for his electric pitching and vibrant personality. The tragedy highlighted issues of reckless behavior and substance use, but ESPN downplayed those details in coverage, focusing instead on his playing career. The Mark Fidrych accident. Mark the Bird. Fidrych, a fan favorite and 1976 Rookie of the Year with the Detroit Tigers, died in 2009 in a tragic accident on his Massachusetts farm. He had been working on his dump truck when his clothing became tangled in a spinning part of the machine, killing him instantly. Fidrych was only 54 years old. His death was gruesome and sudden, cutting short the life of one of baseball's most colorful figures. This was reported on briefly, but the stories avoided describing the disturbing details of how the accident occurred. The death of Josh Hancock. On April 29, 2007, St. Louis Cardinals pitcher Josh Hancock was killed in a car crash when he rear-ended a parked tow truck. Investigators found that Hancock had been intoxicated, was speeding, and had been using his phone while driving. He was only 29 years old. The incident drew attention to the dangers of drinking and driving among professional athletes. ESPN covered the basic facts but avoided prolonged focus on the reckless behavior that caused his death, which made it one of MLB's darker modern controversies. Some stories are too dark for ESPN and other sports news networks, but not too dark for us. Subscribe and join the lineup because the controversies never stop coming. Don't get caught looking. Swing at that subscribe button now.